Welcome. I'm Diane Smith, and I'll be moderating today's Candidates Forum on Disability Issues. Before we begin, I'm going to ask Jessica Snowadsky, our technical coordinator, to provide some information about access and logistics. Jessica?
Hello, everyone. This is Jessica. We have our interpreters, Bryn and Kim, and they will always be visible on your screen. If you use captioning, please use the link that we have provided in your registration confirmation email, or you can access the link in the chat that I will post momentarily. If you experience any problems accessing interpreters or captioning, or experience technical difficulties, please type your questions into the chat. Please do not place any questions unrelated to accessibility or technical difficulties into the chat. The Candidates Forum Committee has solicited questions from the Alliance and drew upon those in preparing questions for the moderator. Please do not place any comments about the candidates in the chat, as this is a nonpartisan event. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn the event over to Diane Smith.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica, and good afternoon. I want to welcome some 265 of you that had registered for the forum as of a few minutes ago, including, we just want to say a very fine welcome to our former governor, Dannel Malloy. I'm Diane Smith. I'll be serving as your moderator today. This is the third time I've moderated the Connecticut Cross Disability Lifespan Alliance Candidates Forum. Quick introduction, I've been a television and radio journalist in Connecticut for 30 years, working at Channel 8, CPTV, CTN, and WTIC News Talk 1080. These days, I'm a full-time faculty member at the University of New Haven. So thank you for being with us. This is the fifth of these forums, sponsored by the Connecticut Cross Disability Alliance, Disability Rights Connecticut, Connecticut State Independent Living Council, Connecticut Developmental Disability Council, and the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Today's forum is going to be a little bit different, as it is the first virtual forum, but COVID has changed a lot of things, but it won't keep us down. So thank you for being here. In addition, we want to let you know that CTN is covering the event today, and they will be airing the event with captioning in the next few days. A captioned and sign language interpreted version of the forum will also be available on YouTube, and you'll get an email letting you know when the YouTube link is available. You should have already received an email containing a booklet with information about the congressional candidates and the presidential candidates, including third-party candidates. In case you're not sure which congressional district or CD you live in, you can look up your town on the pages about the candidates. Also attached to the email is a voter education document that covers registering to vote, making a plan to vote, and tips for absentee balloting. After the forum, you're going to receive an evaluation and links to CTN and the YouTube versions of the forum so that you can rewatch it or you can tell friends to tune in. And we hope that you will definitely complete that evaluation because our funding for future candidates forums is dependent on you completing the evaluation. A very, very full agenda today. I'm excited to tell you that all of the Democratic and Republican congressional candidates have confirmed their participation and that we have surrogates for the Republican and Democratic presidential candidates. Today we will work very similarly as in the past. We have asked the candidates to present their platform on disability issues for up to 3 minutes. Then I'm going to follow up with 4 minutes of questions. Surrogates for candidates will have 3 minutes to present their candidate's platform, and they will not be asked questions. So let's go now to our first candidate. Very happy to be joined right now by Congressman Joe Courtney. Congressman Courtney is a Democrat representing Connecticut's 2nd Congressional District. Since 2007, his district encompasses most of the eastern third of the state, including Norwich and New London. Congressman, I said that just like a native, didn't I?
Beautiful.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
So tell us a little bit about your platform on these issues.
So, well, thank you, Diane, and to the forum, the organizers, Melissa, Marshall, you every 2 years, have been very diligent in terms of making sure that all candidates from both parties and, want to issue a hello and welcome to my opponent, Justin Anderson, and that, uppermost in our minds are the priorities of the disabilities community. And it's a community that's made a lot of big difference over the time that I've been in Congress. In 2017, when there was a push to repeal the Affordable Care Act, in many cases, it was the disabilities community who spoke out so forcefully about the damage that would be done if the ACA was repealed. The Congressional Budget Office at the time estimated that roughly 20 million people would have lost their health insurance, the Medicaid program, which is so critical in terms of not just healthcare, but also a variety of other services for people with disabilities, including transportation, other forms of medical equipment, again, would have been gutted. And when John McCain gave the thumbs down to stop the repeal from going through, I mean, he spoke for so many people all across the country who, again, provided that external pressure on Washington, D.C. In 2020, in some ways, the challenges facing the disabilities community is even more, existential and critical. COVID has posed a threat really to every corner of the country, but individuals with disabilities in particular, I think have really taken the brunt of the pandemic. The requirements of social distancing, the requirements of special assistance has really hindered a lot of the access to critical programs that have been built up over the years. I sit on the Education and Labor Committee with my good friend, Johanna Hayes. We've had a number of hearings about the impact of COVID, particularly for students, special education students all across the country who every public school has really struggled in terms of trying to keep kids on track in terms of their educational program and proficiency. The special education community, students, has really been the ones that has been the hardest to reach sometimes with services and trying to, again, keep them engaged in accordance with the IDEA law, which again is committed to providing fair and free services for children who suffer with disabilities. The CARES Act provided some help in terms of getting educational funding out to local school districts through Title I. I'm going to be with some educators up in Enfield later tonight. They got about close to $1 million of emergency CARES Act relief, again, to deal with some of these issues. But anyone who has talked to a school superintendent, teacher, parent knows that we need to provide more resources than the CARES Act. And the HEROES Act, which would provide $100 billion for school districts all across the country. Again, it's in accordance with the IDEA law that would have to, again, make sure that children who suffer from, who have disabilities, and I shouldn't say suffer, who have disabilities are provided, again, the access and help that a COVID relief bill would require. We're still working on that. President sort of changed his mind in the middle of the night, so hopefully it's going to get through.
Yeah, let's hope so. I want to get into a few questions here. Since you are on the Education and Labor Committee, I thought I'd start with one about education, since you particularly mentioned students. And we know that the experience that we've had with COVID and remote learning has really shown how deep the digital divide is in Connecticut. How do you plan to bridge that, particularly for marginalized and multiply marginalized communities, with people attempting not only education, but also to access telehealth?
So, I mean, that is precisely what the HEROES Act is aimed at in terms of addressing the digital divide. There's no question in the 2nd District, there are parts of particularly the Quiet Corner where broadband services is very uneven, and places in more distressed communities. There was a story in the London Day about a family that did not have Wi-Fi, so their children basically could not access the remote learning that was being provided. And again, hybrid learning, remote learning, virtual learning, that's still happening right now as we speak, and the digital divide is real. So the COVID relief bill that, again, we passed in the House twice, had the resources to help address this problem. Moving forward, in July, we passed H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, which is an infrastructure bill, and included, not just surface transportation and other forms of infrastructure, but also broadband access, so that, again, as a nation, we're all going to have equal playing field in terms of access to what is now really almost, essential to succeed in life.
Certainly. Congressman, we know that 42% of all COVID-19 deaths took place in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. And that is where only 0.6% of Americans live. So that's a pretty stunning number. 42% of the deaths, only 6% of the American population. So let me ask you, and Connecticut had very similar numbers. When the governor released his Mathematica report, it showed that, you know, particularly in the first wave, there were about 50 people a day who were dying, and many of them were in long-term skilled care or assisted care. What are we going to do on a federal level to protect your constituents who live in those situations?
And it's still happening now, by the way, in Eastern Connecticut and other parts of the state. So again, if you look at the HEROES Act, we boosted the federal reimbursement under Medicaid, which, as you know, Diane, is the workhorse for nursing home patients that pays the bills. I mean, in some nursing homes, it's almost 80 to 90% of the revenue comes from Medicaid. Having the federal government, you know, increase its match for the state of Connecticut is going to take some pressure off the state and allow them to invest more in terms of, you know, public health measures, PPE, testing and treatment, all the things that were missing last spring and early summer when those numbers were just sickening and happening in that community, unfortunately. The bill also has what's called a nursing home strike force, which is to provide more backup assistance for public health departments because they're the ones who actually regulate the delivery of healthcare. And that's obviously been very deficient.
Congressman, what about more funding for home and community-based services so that people don't have to live in institutions?
Actually, again, so I'm a co-sponsor of the home and it's HR 555, which is a bipartisan bill, the Disability Integration Act, which is, again, precisely aimed at that goal, which is to make sure that people have a choice about you know, where they can receive those services. As I said, it was bipartisan. John Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin and John Lewis, God rest his soul, from Georgia were the lead sponsors. You know, Connecticut has done some, you know, good work in terms of money follows the person, right. But again, it's very limited. You know, it's capped, and HR 555 would move that along. I'm a co-sponsor of that bill.
Congressman, we only have about 30 seconds left, so just quickly, there is a bill known as READY, the Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion for Disasters, and it does tie in a little bit to money following the person because so many people with disabilities are hurt or die in disasters, frequently because they can't get the services that they need when they have to be evacuated or when they have to remain in an area that's been devastated. What can we do about that with the READY Act? Well,
you know, certainly having a statutory priority would be a big help in terms of getting to that goal. When FEMA declares a disaster, I mean, one of the things that we have seen over the number of disasters since I've been in office is trying to make sure that vulnerable populations, you know, really get pushed to the top of the list in terms of things like generators, you know, getting people boots on the ground in these facilities and make sure that people are being cared for, because that is, you know, unfortunately an inevitable outcome with disasters is that people, again, who are vulnerable and have special needs, sometimes really, you know, don't connect to the services that a disaster declaration is aimed at.
Yeah. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you spending some time with us today and hope that you remain well and that your family stays well.
Great. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Melissa. Bye-bye.
Our next candidate is Jonathan Riddle. Jonathan is the Republican who's running in the 4th District against the incumbent Jim Hymes. Jonathan is a director for Altium, a financial consulting and wealth management firm, and this is his first run for public office. And welcome. Thank you for being with us. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's very exciting.
Jonathan, let me ask you a question that was proposed by one of our Alliance members. Have you had one or more personal experiences with disability, either involving yourself or someone you know, that have shaped your attitude toward the rights of people with disabilities? And if so, could you just briefly describe that?
Absolutely.
And then I'm going to let you do your platform.
Sure. So thank you, Diane, for that question. That's incredible. My family has a personal connection to the special needs community. My father runs a tremendous business that works with autistic, ADD, or otherwise special needs children. And he has learning centers and does the complete opposite of what public schooling does. Where they underwhelm the brain and try to just manage and otherwise babysit these children, he overwhelms them and teaches them how to deal with their disability and break through the barriers that they're given in society and become better people, especially with autistic kids. One example, he had a 12-year-old who would never speak in his class and was a C student. In a short 3 months, he had that child talking, socializing, and was an A student after that.
Wonderful story.
Yeah, my father's been doing it for over 30 years.
Wow.
And it's truly incredible.
Very early on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Riddle, let me give you 3 minutes now to talk about your platform on issues regarding people with disabilities.
Sure. So, it's, as we all know, it's the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act, and it's just incredible what this act has done since 1990. The ADA covers so many things like employment, housing, public accommodations, education, transportation, communication, recreation, institutionalization, health services, voting, and access to public services. These are very, very important things that the disability community needs, and it should be always protected. Without the ADA, there might be no integration in schools or employment, and the disability community might be banished and treated like a burden to society. And we can't have that. We can't have them confined to their houses or institutions just because of something that's out of their control. It's thankful that we have the ADA to prohibit such nasty laws in the past that prohibited unwanted people from being on the street in the public eyes of the law, or sterilization laws that were early 1900s. I am in full support of the ADA, and as we go along, we need to keep a watchful eye to ensure that these rights are not infringed on. And additionally, we need to be proactive to take steps to enforce the protections the ADA affords.
Thank you for that. A couple of questions, a little bit about housing. People with disabilities, and especially people who are multiply marginalized with disabilities, are disproportionately poor and have been greatly impacted by COVID-19, in particular as it relates to their employment and to housing stability. How would you support prevention of eviction going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And so as a society here in America, we need to protect the most vulnerable. I was in Trumbull Gardens, which is a housing community in Bridgeport yesterday, and heard many of these stories of individuals who have disabilities and cannot get work because of their disability. And it's important that we, as a community, as a country, as a government resource, take care of these individuals and ensure that they don't get evicted, and really help them get on their feet when they've exhausted their resources in order to find work and responsibly pay for their housing. So the government is there for those, to protect those who cannot protect themselves and provide for themselves. And I think we should hold that true, especially during these tremendously difficult times. We handed out food and supplies to individuals, over 100 of them yesterday in the Trumbull Gardens. And it was incredibly joyful to see the smiles on people's faces who are struggling through this pandemic and don't have the resources to provide for their families. And it was incredibly heartbreaking hearing some of the stories, but I'm very happy to work with Harry Bell, a color of positive thought in Bridgeport, who's done tremendous community work. I just met him last week, and I had to get involved with what he was doing.
Jonathan, just one more question, and I'll ask you to make the answer a little bit on the short side. As I was talking to Congressman Courtney, I was saying to him that, at the height of the first wave of COVID, about 50 people a day were dying at Connecticut's long-term care facilities. The rate of death was above 60% in those facilities in Connecticut, even higher for people of color and Black people. How would you, on a federal level, protect your constituents who live in those facilities going forward?
Yeah, so I think there's actually a failure of Governor Lamont's. Instead of putting the individuals who were tested positive for coronavirus in care facilities such as the hospitals, ICUs, et cetera, he sent them along with Cuomo to the elderly communities where they infected the rest, and ultimately had the vulnerable get sick and in some cases die. That's terrible tragedy, and I think from a federal standpoint, we need to be there for the resources and stopgap that the states cannot afford.
Jonathan Riddle, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you all the best in your campaign, and I hope that you and your family stay well.
Thank you very much. Have a great one.
Thank you very much. Joining us next is Congressman John Larson. Congressman Larson is a Democrat who was elected to the 1st Congressional District in 1998, and he has held the seat since then. Congressman Larson?
Hi, Diane.
How are you? I'd love to give you about 3 minutes or so to talk about your platform. Maybe you'd like to turn on your camera too.
Yeah, Yeah, I wish I was as adept at this as,
Host has to turn it on.
right, they're saying that you have to turn it on, whatever that means.
Jessica, can you turn on Congressman Larson's camera?
I actually look better blank here, Diane.
There you go.
Hey.
No, you look good. Okay. So 3 minutes to talk a little bit about your platform on people with disabilities.
Well, sure. First of all, let me thank everybody for hosting these. And let me get right to the chase. I'm honored to be on the Ways and Means Committee, on the Social Security Subcommittee, of which I chair. And as you know, Social Security focuses directly not just on people's retirement, but importantly on spousal dependent coverage and disability. This is a fund that has not been touched by Congress and improved and enhanced in over 37 years, in more than 55 years since we've actually enhanced the system. We've put forward a proposal that will expand Social Security and do so in a manner in which it is both affordable and continues to make it the most accessible program for people all across this great country of ours. I am proud to author it as well, along with a number of my colleagues, the Protecting Access to Wheelchairs Act, which passed into law. The law helps people suffering from degenerative disease such as ALS access individualized wheelchair accessories, equipment that they need to live their lives independently and with dignity. It does this by restoring appropriate Medicare payments rates for manual wheelchair accessories. And I'm glad that that was able to be signed into law, and it does demonstrate that you can work across the aisle with people and get things done. I think that protecting those amongst us with disabilities is becoming even more important, as you have noted, and I heard previous speakers say as well, especially during this time of the COVID pandemic. And it certainly has drawn greater focus to the need of all of us to make sure that we're staying healthy and also that we're following and taking basic precautions that are needed, and especially as it relates to helping those amongst us with disabilities who need our assistance most. So with that, let me throw it open to questions that you might have.
Hey, Congressman, I'd like to ask you about some proposed legislation, the legislation that would help provide some funding for people who are unemployed due to COVID. We hope something's going to go forward. I know the House has already passed it a couple of times, but it would also shield nursing homes from liability, and in some circumstances could waive civil rights protections, including ADA protections, until 2024. What's your position on this, and what would you do to protect your constituents who live in skilled nursing facilities?
Well, we think that it's important legislation, but equally as important is making sure that we protect the rights, especially those with disabilities, as we go forward. And there needs to be modification. We think that clearly, as in many cases, when you're dealing with a pandemic of this nature and with its broad reach, that you want to ensure first and foremost that the people that are administering care and that are providing the essential healthcare needs that our constituents might have, that they are safe and secure. But also we want to make sure that nobody who is mistreated during this process, intentionally or otherwise, does not carry with it the protections and the backup of the government as well. And I think both of these are achievable goals within any legislation, and that's what I would support.
Congressman, of course, we've talked in the past about housing and about transportation, and transportation is still an issue for people with disabilities. You know, all transportation should be accessible, but we know it isn't. And it's so important, particularly if people want to be able to get to the doctor, to school, meetings with friends, you know, when we can actually leave our houses again and get to work. What are we going to do to advocate for more accessible and comprehensive transportation options for people with disabilities, including planes, trains, automobiles?
Well, it's a great point, Diane, and this is something you've been working on for a long time as well. And You're right. I mean, we do have accessibility, but it's limited. And we have to continue to make sure that first and foremost, in any comprehensive transportation bill that comes forward, especially as we look at intermodal transportation in all of its forms, that we're taking into consideration those with disabilities and make access key to implementing any kind of program that we go forward with. There will be a huge transportation infrastructure budget and proposal in the next session of Congress. And at the forefront of those has got to be the need to make sure that they are accessible from a disability standpoint so that everybody has an equal opportunity and access to get the basic needs that they require.
Congressman, one last question, and that is, I know that you're terribly aware of the death toll from COVID at our nursing homes and skilled nursing homes and assisted living, not only in Connecticut, but elsewhere as well. That would seem to indicate that we ought to be getting more people out of facilities and living in the community. That, of course, is going to require more money for home and community-based services. Where are we going to get that money from to be able to make that happen?
Well, I think that first and foremost, it's a matter of necessity. And the one thing that you learn during a pandemic like this is the unmet needs and also some of the solutions that you're going to have as you go forward. Like anything else in life, these things cost money, but it's money that's well spent. Well, money is spent to save lives and be able to place people in situations where both they and also the workforce that's caring for them is going to be protected. That's money that's well spent. And I think the American people get that and understand. Who knows as this disease evolves and there's rumors that we could be facing another kind of strain that may be different than this. We've got to be prepared for that. One thing we have learned is that we have been woefully unprepared, and the reaction overall, especially coming from the executive branch, has been slow and not enough. And so we have to make sure that we're willing to put forward the kind of dollars that are going to be needed to treat this ongoing pandemic in a way that works for all of our citizens.
We'll be watching the Ways and Means Committee to see what happens. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us today. Glad to have you again. Good to see you. Our next candidate is Justin Anderson. He's the Republican candidate who is running against Joe Courtney in the 2nd District. Justin served 30 years in the Connecticut National Guard. He has been deployed 4 times since 9/11, including 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. He's a retired correctional officer who served 20 years in a maximum security prison. And Justin Anderson is joining us now. Jessica, can you turn on his camera and mic, please? Let me know if we have a technical problem, and I'll go to the next candidate, and then we'll circle back to Mr. Anderson if we need to do that.
Oh, here we
Okay,
go.
I see you there, Mr. Anderson.
Hi.
There you go.
How you doing? Okay.
I'm going to ask you a quick question, then I'm going to ask you to tell us your platform. But I'm seeing here that you served 30 years in the National Guard, deployed 4 times, 2 combat tours, retired correctional officer. Why do you want to get into politics? Haven't you had enough suffering in your life?
No, well, you know, really I got in the military over 30 years ago, and I come from a very patriotic family, and I'm always concerned about the future. You know, as a soldier, I'm willing to fight, you know, for the future of America. And that's just kind of, you know, how myself and my family, you know, are. And one of the things that I saw is it's recently, where America is going is very concerning. There's a lot of values that I grew up with. If you worked hard enough, go out there, you can be anything you want in America. And there's a lot of stuff that has allowed America to be the way we are right now. And I do see a shift in politics and ideology away from the values that I think are core values that have allowed us to be the America that they are. So right now, our future, like the battlefront for our future for me, is no longer in the military. It's now in politics. So it's really the same fight, and it's really the same concerns. It's just that right now the battle's in politics.
Mr. Anderson, why don't you take 3 minutes to tell us a bit about your platform on issues relating to people with disabilities, please?
Okay, well, I mean, to understand how important this is, 26% of individuals with disabilities are living below poverty level compared to about 11% with people without disabilities. Over 25% of family members or families have members with disabilities. So this is very important for really all of society. We need to get to a goal where the people with disabilities have the same opportunities and can achieve the same financial independence as those without disabilities. And that's hard when you look at, the amount of people, the amount of families that have disabilities and the fact that they really are hard hit when it comes to, jobs that can support them. Right now, we're looking at even a bigger issue because we have, COVID-19 and really people with disabilities are hit the hardest because of this. Access to community-based services is threatened. We have a loss of personal assistance and services. There's a shortage of care workers due to the COVID-19. People, are not able to go to work. And, they have to take care of themselves or, people who, do have issues or, concerns with the COVID-19. We have less people out in the workforce that can take care of people with disabilities. So that's important. Even family caregivers, and members of families, they're getting stretched very thin. If you're a family member with somebody who needs, assistance, you can't always get somebody out there with that assistance. So the whole transportation aspect is really important, and having the services so people can get out is immensely important. And also we're looking at job loss. The amount of people who have disabilities, trying to incorporate them into a society, where people without disabilities, are out there working and doing their thing. You had COVID-19 and now how do they compete in a society where now we have less jobs, less jobs for everybody, let alone people with disabilities. So how do we keep them out there? How do we make sure that, people with disabilities, have, food? How can they pay rent? How do they do this stuff if they've been, either furloughed or terminated from a job simply because, as a whole, people across America, the jobs just aren't available. Mm-hmm. So it's a large concern and it's a large population that we should be concerned about.
Mr. Anderson, you mentioned unemployment, and people with disabilities typically have an unemployment rate of 66%. During COVID, people with disabilities, particularly multiply marginalized people, have disproportionately lost their jobs. How do you address that if you're elected?
Well, certainly a lot of the when you look at the COVID-19 assistance, that has to be included into the bill simply because it's such a large part of what happens when people lose jobs. Literally, people with disabilities are hit a lot harder, than people without disabilities. So that has to be taken very strongly into consideration. Once again, when we start looking at other bills, when you look at, the infrastructure bills or even the educational budget, kids with disabilities are going to have a lot harder time, making sure that they have the appropriate tools, access, like Joe Courtney even brought up himself. We have areas in Eastern Connecticut where we don't have the Wi-Fi available. So we've got to make sure that all these assets are available to the children, and you got to pull them. You can't just look at one area and say, hey, I want to have this one budget. I mean, yeah, that's good. If we can pass some bills that include the disability, but you have to pull from something like the COVID-19 assistance, the infrastructure assistance for transportation, and you have to look at the educational budget for the young kids with disabilities. So you got to pull from every direction and make sure that all assistance or all bills or all funding and budgets include a strong, mindful access for people who have disabilities.
You mentioned housing and how people with disabilities can be, in danger of losing their housing. What would you do to support prevention of eviction, particularly in this post-COVID-19 or current COVID-19 situation?
Well, I think that's a huge concern, and it's tough because you do have people that they're landlords and they're losing money, and that's what makes it so hard. You don't want to evict anybody, but when we're looking at the situation, the people that we should put first and foremost are people with disabilities, because you can't be putting, people with disabilities out on the street. Their ability to bounce back. And once again, we got to look, back at the employment rate and all the other things, the poverty rate. They're so below the normal poverty level at 26% compared to the normal 11% for most people. They're going to be hit the hardest. They have to be taken care of first in that aspect. So there has to be protections. There has to be, I believe strongly in community. Another aspect we have to look at, is the banking aspect, because you got to look at the amount of people with disabilities who are either unbanked or, not well banked. In other words, they just don't have banking accounts, or they don't have the access to the funds and the loans and stuff like that. So the banking community, has to work at a level where in these situations they can give out loans at, at minimal, percentage rates, so that if somebody has to get by for a short amount of time, or if they're getting pushed, where they're going to be pushed out of a living situation, where they can get these loans to sustain it, so they can get through this COVID-19 and get back on their feet, so that the banking can help us out a lot with that.
You bring up a very interesting point. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Anderson. Pleased to have you with us. Good luck with the campaign, and I hope you and your family stay well.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate this. I want to thank everyone who's on here, and thank you very much for the time. This was awesome.
Well, we're glad to have you. Thank you so much. Our next candidate is Margaret Streicher, and Margaret is the Republican running in the 3rd CD against Rosa Delauro, who has represented that district since 1991. Ms. Streicher is a new face on the political scene. She's a successful real estate developer, and she has been able to partially self-fund her campaign, which has allowed her to run a very robust campaign and place a high volume of ads on television. And first thing I might ask you before I ask you to express your platform, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
It's Margaret Streicher, and I am just getting off a plane, so pardon me as I am trying to adjust myself. Can you see me, or it's lit improperly?
Okay, Jessica, our technical person, are we getting a good shot of Ms. Streicher, and are you satisfied with her sound?
You sound fine. A little bit more lighting would be best, but we can work with this.
All right.
If there's a way you could get a little bit more light on yourself, either turning toward the window or turning a light on above you, that would be great.
Sorry, I just came for an 18-hour jaunt to fun.
Much better, much better. Okay, very good. Now we can see you very well. So let me give you about 3 minutes to discuss what's your platform on issues for people with disabilities.
Okay, well, so thank you first for having me here today, and I apologize I missed the first bit, as I just mentioned, getting off the plane. I'm Margaret Streicher. I'm both the Republican and the independent candidate for Connecticut's 3rd District, running for the United States Congress. So I am on 2 tickets. And I guess I will open saying that growing up in an extended family with differently abled relatives meant that from a very young age, I was exposed to some of the challenges and opportunities for compassion and personal excellence that many families face. And given that now that 25% of the country has some diagnosed form of learning differences, it's also important not to lump all of the issues into one bucket, but really recognize that we are facing and acknowledging that we're facing disability or differently abled abilities in a very large spectrum. And across that spectrum, there are different issues and different needs under the umbrella of what's still called disability issues. Most importantly, what's necessary is the ability for these individuals affected and these families affected to have the people live in dignity with the support and the resources necessary so that they can live productive lives. I will also point out that Connecticut, back in, I believe it was 1821, opened the first house or school, as they called it. It was called a house for the deaf at the time. And that was the first recognized formal school in the United States for people with different abilities. So the point is that Connecticut has a long history of addressing the needs of those who are differently abled than many. And I think that this is something that at the federal level, we need to continue to recognize. And again, with the goal of making sure that each individual across wherever they may be on a spectrum is able to live a life of dignity and to the best or, most complete life that is meaningful to them. I wasn't clear if I was supposed to be fielding questions or...
Yes, you are, and I can do that now. Ms. Streicher, I know that you are a single mother of 4 children. And so I want to ask you a question about education. It has really come to be very obvious to us during the pandemic how deep our digital divide is in Connecticut. We've seen children who are really having trouble accessing remote education because of that digital divide, and adults who are unable to work from home, and people who cannot access telehealth. What would you do on the federal level to try to bridge that digital divide?
Certainly, I've actually taken this up as an issue, and I took it up as a kitchen table issue recently. The digital divide is one, and I speak to infrastructure as a whole across Connecticut that's crumbling, but certainly the digital infrastructure is a critical infrastructure as we are moving well into the 21st century. To acknowledge that there is a problem in Connecticut, and I think we can all experience this problem on a nearly daily basis, is extraordinarily stressful and it's extraordinarily frustrating for those who have the complete skill set and ability to access it. And as we move down economic spectrums or across differently learning spectrums, it's particularly important to recognize just how stressful this can also be. So it's not just the need to access, but it's the additional, I'm going to say, component into one's daily life of what it means to then be disconnected. Having, again, 4 school-age children, I can assure you that I am dealing on a near daily basis with what this means during the COVID pandemic. But to suggest that this hasn't all impacted us is folly. But for instance, I'm going to say back in March, right when this was new, and everyone's, will say, still in the moments of freaking out about what this means for the daily schedule, I put something on Facebook saying, now do you understand what people with autism feel like daily, right? You have a change in schedule and suddenly, you know, every adult in society is, you know, having trouble figuring out how to get out of their gym clothes every morning. What happens for the people where this is, and I was referring in that case to autism, where this is a daily occurrence, where, you know, the change of schedule can fundamentally throw them off. So part of this is not just what the services are, but also how we as a society deal empathetically and with compassion for those who have special needs and, you know, are in different places. And in terms of the education, because we're bringing this back to education, even within my own family, I can see the difference in how my own children are relating across the needs. So fortunately, you know, I am blessed to say that, you know, none of mine would fall into the category we're talking about today, but still the need for connection, the need for interpersonal skills, not underestimated, which is also why I've reached out to, frankly, many of the principals in all of the schools across the district to introduce myself and say, what do you need? How can we?
Yeah. Ms. Streicher, I'd like to ask you another question, and that is something we've been talking about a bit with this, which is housing, and particularly in light of COVID and in light of the fact that people with disabilities are disproportionately below the poverty level. They are more susceptible to losing their housing by eviction. What would you do on the federal level to try to prevent that? And I know that you can speak from the perspective of a real estate developer as well.
Yes, so I have a tremendous amount of experience in housing. I've been running multifamily housing for upward of a decade and a half. I am proud to say that I have actually been very in tune with some of the housing needs and issues, and we were able to modify housing. The ADA, the American Disabilities Act, as it pertains to those with physical disabilities, is very clear. It's been longstanding. It's certainly it's, you know, written into code, I believe, since 1981 or 1986. Pardon me, I just misspoke on the date. But with regard to the social and emotional disability issue, that hasn't yet really been taken into account in the housing system. With regard to that, there are many, you know, private programs. There are governmental programs. If we're dealing with the Section 8, then, you know, there are special categories by which people can qualify into. As a federal level, frankly, there is not much that is currently being offered as I see it as a person who's participating in it. It's really more at the city and state levels. There are codes and compliance in terms of treating people fairly and equitably. But in terms of the rental supplement and things like that, that tends to still remain at the local and state levels.
All right, and I just wanted to ask you one more question. I'd like to ask you if you get a little bit closer to your microphone, your computer. Some people are having a hard time hearing you. And I'm wondering, what do you think about how the federal government ought to manage the anticipated increase of COVID-19 in Connecticut and across the nation as the weather gets colder?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you now.
Oh, sorry about that. I was wondering what you think the federal government ought to do to help with what is anticipated to be an increase in COVID cases in Connecticut and across the country as the weather gets colder and people are indoors more.
Are we talking about the medical perspective?
Whatever
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, you're coming through very blotchy.
Okay.
So in terms of what the government ought to do, I do believe in the separation between the federal, state, and local governments. I do believe in the sovereignty of the state. So I think thus far, a lot of what has happened has been to enable the states to act as they see best fit with certain guidelines. I don't think that we should be rewriting that script at this point in time. In terms of actually addressing what this means, I think obviously safety and the well-being is a very important thing, but I also do recognize that if we don't have our economy kind of back on track, there will be further collateral issues having to do with the loss of employment. And so this is a very difficult line to cross in terms of what this means for the economy side and people's ability to earn income and what this means for the health. Right now, I am more concerned with a permanent loss of economy because I think there have now been studies coming out that this is mutated to the point where it is less impactful. And we have, I think, also a large issue that we have not yet fully addressed, especially as it pertains to children with depression and the kind of social emotional needs of what this means to isolate out of society. I think people have gotten to the point where they, as the days are getting shorter, the nights are getting colder, etc., they need the kind of compassion of community in many ways. And so how we do that safely and securely is clearly a concern, but I don't think that the isolation model is a healthy one for protracted periods of time.
Well, Ms. Streicher, it's been very interesting meeting you, and I want to wish you well in your campaign and hoping that you and your family stay well in the face of the pandemic. So thank you so much for your time.
You as well. Thank you.
Nice to have had you. Thank you. Our next candidate is Congressman Jim Hymes. He's a Democrat who has represented the 4th CD congressional district since 2009. And good afternoon, Congressman Hymes.
Okay, am I coming across there?
You are coming across fine.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm so delighted that you've invited me for this 10-minute discussion. Thank you. Look, there's 61 million people in this country with disabilities. That's a major chunk of our population. And we've obviously made real progress, you know, starting from when I was 2 years old in 1968, when we passed the Fair Housing Act, you know, through to the passage of the American Disabilities Act in 1990. You know, and I'm delighted to say that at least with over the time I've been in politics, I think we've taken some really important steps forward with respect to treating Americans with disability with the dignity they deserve to be treated. I hearken back, of course, 10 years ago to the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And I want to spend a second on that because it's very much in jeopardy today. And it's not just the 20 million people who have been covered. It's not just pre-existing conditions that would go away. And by the way, don't believe for 1 second when you hear the President of the United States say that he's going to preserve the prohibition on people with pre-existing conditions being denied insurance. Look, one of those pre-existing conditions, of course, is a disability. And so I can't stress how important it is that we keep our eye on that particular ball. It's in the Supreme Court, but when you hear somebody not commit themselves to preserving and expanding on the Affordable Care Act, danger on that issue. Look, I'm delighted to, there hasn't been a ton of legislation in this Congress, quite frankly. But as you probably are aware, in the CARES Act, which was actually a piece of bipartisan bicameral legislation I'm very proud of, we included $15 million for Section 811 housing, which of course is very, very important to our disability community. I am not happy with the fact that that CARES Act, of course, excluded adult dependents of other taxpayers in the $1,200 distribution. I won't go into the details of that, but the HEROES Act, which was the sort of follow-on that we passed in the House a couple of months later, And the most recent bill that we passed last week in the House included adult dependents of taxpayers in the distribution of economic aid. So I may be getting close to my 2 minutes. I know that you have questions, but
Yes.
I'm really delighted to have been invited to participate in this forum. And, you know, I hope if I'm reelected to have the opportunity to continue to fight for my constituents who are living with disabilities.
And Jim, some of those constituents are living in nursing homes and in assisted living situations. And as we know, those two types of facilities were very hard hit by deaths in COVID. What would you do to try to protect your constituents who live in those circumstances in the future as COVID continues to be affecting our population?
Yeah, look, we're obviously going to need to do a deep dive into the model of nursing homes and assisted living facilities. I mean, the fatalities here in the state of Connecticut were beyond out of control. And it, you know, no surprise, we know how this virus spreads. I disagree with the previous speaker who said that it's becoming a little bit less, it's evolving to become less intense. There's no evidence that that's the case. And I would hope she might not say that to any of the families of the 2,000 or 3,000 Americans who've died in the last couple of days of COVID. But we very clearly need to rethink the model of the nursing home where you have people living in close proximity by definition with comorbidities. And of course, you have a fairly significant labor force moving in and out on a shift basis. So, you know, the story has yet to be told. We've got to really study this closely. But I do think that at a minimum, we're going to need to implement procedures in nursing homes and other congregate living facilities that when we do see a pandemic again, and we will, this is not the end of this story, that we have the ability to essentially disperse people. Not easy, of course, because these are people who require care. But my guess is that we're going to realize that we're going to need to develop the ability to very quickly disperse and make safe a pretty significant and vulnerable population.
One of the other things that would help, I suppose, is to be able to have people living outside of these facilities and in the community. But of course, that takes a lot more money for home and community-based services. Maybe not more money than it costs to live in a facility, but we would need more funding for those services for them to be able to live independently. Would you support a major investment in HCBS along with supporting reauthorization of Money Follows the Person program?
Look, I think it's yes is the answer to that question. I mean, I've had any number of conversations lately with an incredible array of doctors who are touting the forced experiment they were required to undertake with respect to telemedicine. You know, I think telemedicine is going to really open some doors for everybody, but especially for the disability community. And look, I think we all understand that it is almost always better for somebody to be able to remain in the home than to be institutionalized. Better by every metric. It's less expensive. It's less dangerous. And of course, who doesn't want to stay at home when they can? So I'm very, very interested in models that allow for better in-home care.
One last thing, and that is that some of the proposed legislation that would follow the HEROES Act and the CARES Act that going forward would provide some funding to people who are unemployed. But one of the other things that appears to be being considered in the bill is shielding nursing homes from liability and in some circumstances, even waiving civil rights protections, including the ADA. What's your position on this and what would you do about it?
Yeah, look, waiving civil rights protections and ADA, that's just ridiculous. And, you know, there's no reason why we should reduce access or anything else just because we're living in the COVID world. The question of liability protection is actually an interesting one. And I'll just give you very quickly the principle by which I think about it, because there's lots of different proposals out there. You know, universities, businesses, nonprofits, you name it in my districts are saying, we really do want to come back and we want to do it safely, but we also want to make sure that we then don't have to spend gazillions of dollars on legal fees because of suits. Right. So to me, the principle that is important is that if we develop, and let's just talk about nursing homes or assisted living facilities, if we develop a set of practices that we agree are best practices and safe practices, and if those facilities observe those safe and best practices, I'm open to the concept of a safe harbor from litigation. What I'm not open to, and there's a balance here, is anything that is a get out of jail free card, obviously for negligent behavior or for, you know, we're just going to open come hell or high water. So there's a balance there. And it's a conversation, I think, you know, if we do are fortunate enough to get a second follow-on CARES package done, you know, we're going to have to, this is a big one for Mitch McConnell. We're going to have to say, look, so long as that under no circumstances can that be permission to do anything that is not entirely safe.
Mm-hmm. Well, Congressman Jim Hymes, I want to thank you for joining us. I happen to live in your district, so I'm glad to have some time with you, and thanks for being here today.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Our next candidate is Congresswoman Rosa Delauro. Of course, she's a Democrat. She has represented the 3rd Connecticut congressional district, which is centered around the New Haven area for nearly 30 years now. And Congresswoman Delauro, thanks so much for being with us today. How are you today?
I'm well, my dear. How nice to see you. I'm honored really to be with you and to be with everyone out there and talking about something we all care so deeply about. It's achieving a fair and inclusive society where the full American dream is really accessible to all. And you are emceeing again, Diane, and it's great. It's great really to be with you.
Well, I like talking before you rather than after you. I always tell people you never want to follow Rosa because she's a hard act to follow.
Please.
So tell us a little bit about your platform for people with disabilities.
Sure.
Coming.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. July marked 30 years since a Republican president, and it was a Democratic Congress that enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act. A transformational advance in the rights and the well-being of people with disabilities. I believe we have to be doing more and certainly not doing less. I think you folks know that I chair the subcommittee that directs federal funding for special education, for supportive services for disabled individuals, and for grants for organizations like Easter Seals and Disability Council. So I recognize that the power that comes with this leadership position means that I have an obligation to be creating that opportunity for people, including those living with disabilities. In the CARES Act, I was so proud to help secure $955 million to support nutrition programs, home and community-based services, support for family caregivers, expanded oversight protections for seniors and individuals with disabilities. And there was an additional $200 million to assist nursing homes with infection control to help states prevent the spread of coronavirus in our nursing homes. We provide more in the HEROES Act, 10% increase for Medicaid's home and community-based services, $150 million for rapid response teams, iteration of the HEROES Act. There's $1.17 billion to support home and community-based supportive services, family caregivers, adult protective services programs, assistive technology, and for about $500 million for strike teams. Healthcare is a right to which every American needs and deserves full, affordable, and equitable access. Families should not have to spend themselves into poverty to get the care that they need for an aging loved one or family members who live with disabilities. So I introduced Medicare for America, first piece of legislation that is comprehensive to achieve universal, high quality, affordable health care. It establishes the gold standard for long-term services and support, ensures individuals languishing on Medicaid waiting lists do not have to wait a day longer, with full funding necessary to end those waiting lists. So I think you all know me. I don't back down from fights. Federal government, in my view, must act robustly and swiftly for all of you, for that American dream to be fully accessible, for our society to be fair and to be also inclusive. So that's where I've been, and that's where I want to go.
Rosa, I have a question for you that we haven't had a chance to ask too many of our other candidates, but I think it's a really interesting one. We've seen so many natural disasters hit our country. You know, put aside COVID for a minute. Think of the increase in hurricanes, the wildfires out in California, and frequently people with disabilities are really hit even harder than others. They tend to be 2 to 4 times more likely to be critically or fatally injured in a natural disaster, and yet effective response efforts and support focused on these people has been lacking. what do we do to commit to helping these people? What do you think about the READY Act, the Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion for Disasters Act, as well as DERMA, which would mean that Medicaid, if a person had to leave their state and go somewhere else, their Medicaid funding and their other services would fall.
Right. Well, look, you know, these are the moments when no one put themselves in this kind of jeopardy. This is, as you pointed out, natural disaster, the statistics. I'd like to have more about the statistics that you're talking about, because we do have to think about how we address the needs of folks who are disabled, who are living with special needs, and what it is that we can do for them, so that when we're looking at a READY Act, or you know, that the Medicaid being able to follow someone, that's a road that we need to go down in order to give people what they need at a time when they are not responsible for the circumstances in which they find themselves. And that is the perfect place in which the federal government needs to address these issues. It is the challenges, the overwhelming challenges that people have, not that they're from their own making. So supportive of these efforts, and we'll look to the bill that I deal with of being inclusive of these kinds of efforts.
One thing that you mentioned, of course, being on the committee that helps federal funding for special ed, we knew that Connecticut had a deep digital divide to begin with, but it's really been exposed through the pandemic because of so many children having to experience distance learning, adults who can't get access to their work and having to work from home and not having the capacity, people trying to access telehealth. What are we going to do to make sure that everyone in Connecticut, how do we even that out? How do we even that divide?
Yeah. Well, you know, look, I think this is a long-term problem after COVID. I mean, we're trying to deal with the virus now and look at how we test people, how we contact trace, how we provide treatment. But it's going to be a new world afterwards. And that is the digital divide, which I think for students, yes. For adults in jobs, yes. For those who have special needs, yes. And that's what we ought to be thinking about now, is where do we need to invest, and in what kind of training, what kind of technology are we going to be able to employ? Because we're not going back to where we were.
Right.
You know, people out there, we want to get back to normal. Well, there is no normal to go back to. This has been transformational, and it has exposed some of the inequalities that you talk about. And it's a much starker reality for and what worries me, and I speak about this, Diane, what worries me is that those who find themselves underserved at the moment would get the short end of that stick. And unless we are focused on addressing that now, addressing it now, how do we be proactive for the future on making sure that the divide does not get bigger with much greater consequences for whatever group we are speaking about? And I would just say to you, and I would say to the audience, what we need to be doing is thinking about what it is that we need. What should this look like, so that we are preparing an agenda now, that a new administration, new day, whatever, whether it is at the local level, at the state level, or at the federal level, that this is where we believe we ought to go and where money ought to be invested, so that we don't let the consequences of this virus create a whole new set of inequities for people going forward.
and I'm going to wrap up there, but you use the word transformational, which gives me hope because it makes me think that maybe something transformational that is positive will come out of this terrible time that we're living in right now.
Yeah, that's right. And I would just say, I know we have to wrap up. You have, you know, you've got a program here, but that's it. That's what we ought to be thinking about is how do we build the architecture now for what we need in the future to go there and not just be focused on the past or the moment, but let's carry forward. So I'd love to work with all of you. Let's work on that agenda. I will do what I can with my committee, etc., to see what kinds of efforts we can make for the future. So,
wonderful. Thank you so much.
you guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Great seeing you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay well.
You too. Be safe, everyone.
Our next candidate is David X. Sullivan, and he is a Republican who is running in the 5th District. He's running against Johanna Hayes, who is in her first term right now. David Sullivan has been a federal prosecutor for the past 30 years in the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Connecticut. As an assistant U.S. State's attorney, David has extensive trial experience in civil and criminal cases, including drug trafficking and white-collar crimes. And let's see, is he with us now, Jessica? Excellent. Okay. Jessica is going alien, sounds like aliens are landing. Hello, David. How are you? It's nice to see you. You're having a problem with your audio. Let me get some advice from my technical coordinator here. Jessica, what do you suggest that we do? Yeah, that's not good. Jessica, should we see if we could work with David and come back to him?
Maybe he should leave and join again.
David, were you able to hear that? Could you log out and join again? Okay, and I will look for you in a few minutes. I'll give you a few minutes. I'll go on to somebody else. Thank you so much. All right, so we'll come back to David. Do we have, yes, we do. We have Jonathan Slifko with us. And Jonathan is filling in for Joe Biden tonight, which, Jonathan, that's kind of a big step for you and big shoes for you to fill. I should tell you that for those of you that don't know John, which many of us do because he's certainly been an advocate on the political scene a long time, he is part of the Connecticut Biden campaign and is an active advocate for persons with disabilities. And hello, Jonathan, how are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Diane. Thanks for the lovely introduction. It's great to be here.
Well, since Vice President
I
Biden
appreciate it.
is here, we're not going to ask questions. We're going to allow you just to present his platform regarding people with disabilities and perhaps also the ACA.
So I do have some prepared comments, so I'll be happy to speak now. So nothing about us without us. This has been the rallying cry of the disabilities. It's been clear during this administration and even before that this president cares nothing about us and rather do without us. Joe Biden has compassion, he has empathy, and he cares. Remember back to the campaign of 2016 when then candidate Trump mocked New York Times reporter Serge Kowalewski, who suffers from a congenital condition which affects his joints. This was our first insight into Mr. Trump's views towards our community. Joe Biden embraces individuals with challenges, putting a young man who stutters just as he does, front and center at this year's Democratic convention. During the Obama and Biden administration, the White House website had an entire section dedicated to the disability community, rich with resources and opportunities to engage. The day after this president took office, that section was taken down and has never been replaced. Next came the continuous attempts at striking down the Affordable Care Act, and in particular, his attempts to eliminate coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. The Affordable Care Act, as we all know, is an epically historic piece of legislation that has created an insurance lifeline for so many in our community. And this president wants to take this lifeline away, not caring about the consequences. And then there's been the president's handling of the coronavirus, which has resulted in the needless deaths of over 200,000 Americans, including many with disabilities. It is the fundamental lack of leadership, vision, and a plan from this president that has led to, among other things, several months of isolation, forcing events such as one to be held virtually. That isolation can have such a negative effect on anyone's health, let alone individuals in the disability community. And all this president can say is, it is what it is. That brings us to today and the decision we're faced with on Election Day, during this year, the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Vice President Biden believes and states on his website that everyone should be treated with dignity and be allowed to achieve their fullest potential. But he recognizes also that there is much work to do in order to ensure that all people with disabilities are able to participate fully in our communities and enjoy the same kinds of choices and opportunities that many Americans take for granted. That means amending our laws, policies, and culture to ensure full inclusion of the 61 million individuals with disabilities in the United States in all parts of our society. President Biden has plans and goals that prioritize enacting and implementing policies that break down the barriers to access for people with disabilities living and succeeding in their chosen communities. This means good jobs and competitive integrated employment, affordable, accessible, and integrated housing, accessible and affordable transportation, inclusive voting processes, and any other needed long-term services and supports. To accomplish these goals, Vice President Biden plans to appoint a Director of Disability Policy within the Domestic Policy Council to ensure that these issues and so many others receive the attention they deserve at the highest levels of government. In addition to this senior White House official, Vice President Biden will identify and aggressively recruit qualified people with disabilities to fill leadership positions of the administration, and not merely those that relate to disability programs and policies. You can learn so much more on what Vice President Biden's vision is for the disability community at his website, joebiden.com. I'll save you all some time and let you know what's on the president's website pertaining to the disability community. Nothing. Elections have consequences, and the 2016 election has certainly led to catastrophic consequences for the disability community. 20 Vice President is all about us, and he can't do it without us. So let's all be about each other and do it together and elect Joe Biden the next president of the United States. Thank you. Thank you, Diane.
Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. Very good to see you. Always nice to see you. I'm going to ask Jessica now, do you think that we have resolved the audio problems for David Sullivan? Can we go back to him now, Jess?
Yeah, let's give it a try.
Oh dear. Same problem. Jessica, what do you recommend?
Are you joining on just one device? Is it possible that you're joining in on multiple devices? No? I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the problem is.
Do you want to turn his audio back on? Jessica, do you want to unmute David Sullivan? David, let's try it. Okay. No problem. It sounds like aliens are landing in your congressional office. Jessica, what do you think about, what if we did this by phone call instead of by Zoom? We'd lose the image, but we might have much better audio. Is there a way that we could do that?
Yes, stick around. I'll shoot you a chat message with the number so you can join by your phone, okay?
Okay,
All
that
right,
would be great. We will come back to you. Okay. Has Congresswoman Johanna Hayes joined us? I know it's a little bit ahead of her time slot, so I'm not sure if she's here. Is she here? Oh, I think she may be. Johanna Hayes is serving her first term in the 5th Congressional District. She is the first African-American Congresswoman from Connecticut, and this is her first public office. In 2016, she was named National Teacher of the Year by President Barack Obama, and I think that the national attention that she got and the traveling that she did to represent teachers helped to launch her congressional campaign. We have also heard recently that the Congresswoman was diagnosed or as positive with COVID. And I'm wondering, first of all, Congresswoman, how are you feeling today? There she is, okay.
Hi, how are you? I'm feeling good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. You're feeling well. You look well. You don't look like you're too sick, but I heard you have had some symptoms.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel good. Okay. I'm okay right now.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, we won't keep you too long. We don't want to use up all of your energy that's left. But let me let you spend a few minutes, about 3 or 4 minutes now, talking about your platform for issues that relate to people with disabilities.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. And the topic of persons with disability is very near and dear to me. I've spent a significant amount of time in this community. I worked for 14 years at the Southbury Training School with the same group of women. So they became part of my family. So I've dealt with every aspect of living in an institutional setting to transitioning into an independent community living. I worked with my ladies while they performed activities of daily living and went to their job sites. I've, helped to move them out and transition them into group homes when they had community placements. And I've sat in hospitals and held their hand while they took their last breath. And through all of that, my wish was that they would be seen and heard, that people in the community would see them first as people and not identify them by their disability. When we would go out into restaurants, I had to remind people that they had the right to be there and that all they needed were the proper accommodations and that they could do everything just like anyone else. So that has really been the basis of informing my decision-making in Congress. I've taken a number of actions to help the disabled community. Many steps, as you've heard from the other members, that we've taken to protect the ACA, people with pre-existing conditions, to expand Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, to protect Social Security. I recently introduced a resolution to be sure that all federal buildings were ADA compliant. On my Committee of Education and Labor, we marked up critical reforms to assist individuals with disabilities find employment, re-enter the community, and to make a living wage. Very early on in my office, I wanted to not only advocate for disabled individuals, but bring them in. In my time in the school, I taught special education every year and really know the potential that many of my students had if they just had the resources. My number one goal is to fully fund IDEA, to make sure that students have all the resources and the supports that they need. I am a member of the Autism Caucus, and that came as a result of a young man named Chase that I worked with, who I brought on as a judge for the Congressional the Congressional Art Challenge. I was the very first person to bring on a person with disabilities to serve as a judge, because I wanted people to understand what he brought and his talents and his gifts. There's so many other pieces of legislation that I am a sponsor or co-sponsor of. The Disability Integration Act, HRES 806, which is the Voters with Disabilities Bill of Rights. Recently in the CARES package, we fought for the fairness for seniors and people with disabilities so that people would not be forced to repay benefits that they received during this COVID pandemic. And then I think most importantly, the Keep Our Pact Act, which would mandate that Congress meet their obligations to fully fund Title I and the Individuals with Disabilities Act. I think my time as a teacher and just the way that I'm wired forces me to see the potential that people have before other people see that. And that does not stop at communities with disabilities. I think it just really is elevated and illuminated in that space, because I've always felt like you meet people where they are and then you move forward together. And I really have tried to do that in Congress and would love to continue to work with you.
Congresswoman, we don't have too much time. There's so many questions I could ask you, but you brought up something that no one else has talked about today. So I'd like to have you tell us a little bit more about HR 806, the Voters with Disabilities Act.
So that really is to make sure that buildings are compliant, that people have access if they need any services, that they're made available. Because I think that the idea is that people with disabilities are not engaged. Sometimes people who have more severe disabilities, but just because a person, for instance, may not be able to communicate, it doesn't mean that they are not interested and involved. So it really would provide opportunities for individuals with disability to remove all the barriers that would prevent them from getting involved. So it, in essence, is a voter's bill of rights for people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Because of your long experience as an educator, I'm interested in what you think the pandemic has really highlighted and illuminated for us about the divide between our children, the ones that are able to work remotely, even though no child really prefers that over the classroom, I suppose, but the ones that are able to do that pretty successfully and the ones that can't.
Absolutely. I mean, I was very vocal about schools when they first closed and leading up to reopening. It was a conversation that we should have started in the spring. And I think that teachers should have had more preparation and training to meet the needs of students in a virtual world. It's not as simple as just turning off a computer. But I think turning on a computer, I think because of many of the gaps that were revealed, it really forced Congress to begin to think about the needs of students. When we passed the infrastructure bill, we had to include rural broadband infrastructure to address the digital divide. These are things that I've known my entire career. Services for students with disabilities was a huge concern of mine because I recognize that most students receive their services during the school day, whether it be a speech therapist, physical therapy. So we really push for telehealth and telemedicine. In the HEROES Act and the CARES Act, there was $3.5 billion in mental health services. We really have to push for those types of things. We had a hearing on domestic workers where care was being provided in the home. I think that also needs to be extended to children so that those kids could have still received those services outside of the school setting at the level that they need it without parents having to travel or having barriers that prevented the access to those opportunities. So what this pandemic has shown and what I hope that we do moving forward is to take the opportunity to address many of these cracks that have been revealed, things like food insecurity, mental health services, all of the things that we're hearing, because those are not all school-based issues. So for as much as we can, we need to support parents and families and provide those services in a way where if there's any interruption or disruption at the school level, it does not stop the children from getting those much needed services.
Mm-hmm. Congresswoman, one last question, and that is about caregivers. We have heard so much about how important personal assistants and other caregivers are to elderly people and to people with disabilities, and yet they frequently are paid very poorly. What can be done to try to increase the pay for attendants and personal care providers without, at the same time, bankrupting families that may be paying for it?
Well, we just had a hearing about this, and I mean, I've worked in nursing homes. I've worked as a certified nurse's aide and provided care at home, and I know what that means. What we saw during the pandemic is that many of these caregivers were expected to provide their own personal protective equipment or still show up into situations that were not safe. So what Congress has done and what we can continue to do is expand Medicare and Medicaid to cover those services. We can make sure that OSHA protections also extend to home-based care so that caregivers are provided with masks, gloves, all of the protective equipment that they need. We can make sure that families who want to keep their family members at home are able to do that with support from the federal government and not having to bankrupt themselves or clear out their banking account before they have access to those services. But domestic workers is the fastest growing segment of our economy. So we really need to not only train them so that they can provide adequate services in the home, but make sure that that is able to be done in a way that does not bankrupt the families, but also pays them a living wage.
Yes, agreed.
We voted on to raise the minimum wage, and that group of workers, which is typically minority women, it's something where it doesn't matter if there's a snowstorm, if there's a shutdown, no matter what happens, they still report to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And families couldn't get by without them. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and I'm glad that you seem to be feeling better. And I should also say that I saw on Rate My Skype Room that your room is rated very highly. They particularly like your fan. That bronze fan is quite lovely. I'll have to agree with that.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this. This is just an important conversation, and I'm so happy you guys are doing it.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Congresswoman. It's good to see you and see that you seem to be recovering well from COVID. I'm going to wait for Jessica to let me know if we have David Sullivan. Has he been able to call in yet, or are we still waiting for him to get a good connection? Jessica? As far as I can tell, it looks as though we are still waiting to get connected to him. Jessica, if you could just send me a message in the chat, I'd appreciate that. And if we're not prepared for Mr. Sullivan, okay, then let's see if we can move ahead. We'll try to come back to him, of course. And I'm wondering if Ryan Meehan has joined us yet. I know this would be ahead of his time schedule, so he may not be there with us. If he's not, I can certainly move on to someone else. Has Ryan Meehan joined us? I don't think so. All right. So I am going to choose from my bingo card here of all the cards that I see in front of me. And I am going to ask if Mary Fay could join us now. I think that Mary Fay is with us. Mary, I know that this is ahead of your time slot, so maybe you're not quite prepared, but I hope you are. And Jessica, can you open up Mary's microphone and her camera if she is indeed ready and hooked up?
Hi, Diane. I'm here.
Hi, Mary. Thank you for coming early. I know you weren't expecting to be on for another 20 minutes or so, so I certainly appreciate the fact that you're joining us. Let me first introduce you. Mary Fay is a Republican who is running in the 1st Congressional District against John Larson. She is a West Hartford Council member, and she was elected to the Town Council last year. She's held a number of positions in financial services and is the former executive director of the Connecticut State Retirement Authority. So, Mary, thank you so much. And let me give you about 3 minutes to talk about your platform regarding issues that are particularly pertinent to people with disabilities.
Certainly, certainly. And it's been a very good conversation. I've been listening in, so very happy to do that. First of all, this is very personal for me. My mother was a special education teacher for 28 years, and she loved those children. And I think she worked her tail off to get them to their highest and best ability. And she was very, very good at her profession. I'd like to say that I think things have evolved. She was constantly running to the store and buying things for her classroom and for her children. But she was very proud of what she was able to do with these kids, and they absolutely adored her. So that's number one. Number two, when I was growing up, there was a boy next door, and he was severely disabled. And, you know, I'm dating myself now, but back then, the solution was to put the children, he was in Mansfield Training Center, and I was good friends with his older brother as well. And I would go to visit, Brian was his name. And it broke my heart, you know, as a young person to see that. And I think we're much better off now with the Americans with Disability Act having been passed, and people have choice. They can go into group homes, they can stay with their families and have care brought in. And I think it's much more dignified. And I think it really focuses on the abilities. So I'd like to start the conversation for my platform with that. I really do want to focus on abilities instead of disabilities, because I do believe that they are there. I've seen children with Asperger's who were struggling in elementary school and whatnot go on to achieve enormous success in college and major in engineering and incredible programs. And they're the future. They're doing very, very well. And sometimes their disability, believe it or not, can play to their strengths, where they are able to really focus on their studies because they're not distracted by some of the things I might have been, like socializing. So along those lines, my platform will focus on hiring programs. I've seen more folks get into job situations, and if they're able, I think that's perfect. And we need to do more with that. I've seen, you know, entrepreneurship develop around those lines. And I'd like to encourage more small businesses, where 60% of our people are employed through small businesses. And I've seen a coffee shop that just really intrigued me. I'd like to go visit it, where they do, you know, hire folks with disabilities to run the shop. And I'd really like to see that in action. I think we do need to increase special ed funding and give incentives for teachers to go into that, because it is a very difficult assignment versus a classroom. Although all teaching is difficult. I have several family members in that profession. I'd like to see some rehab funding be increased too, because while I'm talking a lot about learning disabilities, there's certainly physical disabilities as well that we need to address. I'd like to see more support for the families. I think, you know, when you are in a situation where you have a disabled family member in any capacity, you don't know where to turn and you don't know where to go. And I think we need to make people more aware of the services that are available so that they can access them easily, because I don't think it's readily available. Let's see, just a couple notes.
Well, I have a few questions. I have a few questions, if you don't mind. I can. You mentioned, letting people have the opportunity to live in different sorts of situations.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has been happening over the years is the National Council for Independent Living. And we have 5 independent living centers here in Connecticut. They provide core services like youth transition, transition from nursing facilities, assistance with employment, community living. However, it's been estimated that it would cost about $200 million more to really fund these centers properly across the country. Would you support more funding for independent living programs?
Yes, I would. I think here in West Hartford, we've been pretty innovative. We actually have a group home that's in a traditional single-family home neighborhood. It's absolutely beautiful, and it fits in nicely with the neighborhood. And they've been the folks in the group home have been very good neighbors, and I think the neighbors enjoy it. So I think we need to have more innovation when it comes to housing and situations for folks. So yes, I would. And we need to integrate people with challenges into normal situations as best we can, because that also helps with their healing and getting better and their socialization. I think, another personal situation I had, which I got to see up close and personal, is my in-laws. My mother-in-law suffered from post-polio syndrome, and as a result was in a wheelchair most of her life. And before they had those handicapped accessed hotel rooms and restrooms and things like that, her life was very challenging. It was very, very difficult. And boy, as those became more into vogue, she could get around like nobody's business. You wouldn't even know she had a disability. So I think we need to be more cognizant of that. I know there's money involved, and I'm not certainly proposing as a fiscal conservative, the sky's the limit and just keep spending, but we've got to find it someplace else. Right. And we've got to money around, because everybody deserves to have a life lived with dignity and to achieve their best. And I think disabled people, mentally or physically, we want to encourage them to live their best life.
So you make a legitimate point that the money will have to come from somewhere else. If you're elected to Congress, where would you consider reapportioning that money? Where would you take money from in order to fund programs like the one we just talked about?
Right. Well, line by line, I think there's probably room, and I know fellow Republicans will lash out at me, but probably within our defense budget, I think we did need to rebuild, and I'm glad that President Trump did put a lot of resources into our military and make sure that they had the equipment and the wherewithal if anything ever happened. Thank God it hasn't, and he's pulled the troops home. But I think there's probably some money there. There's always money to be found if you really look for it. I've run several large businesses, and you always, every year we had to cut our budget by 10%. And I always found the money to do the core things that made sense. It's a matter of prioritization, and you just really have to knuckle down and find the funds. I just think that's the big, you have to go after where the lion's share of the money is. That's one of our biggest items. And that's why, I wouldn't purport to disable our military either by taking too much out, but you go after the bigger budgets and you squeeze here and you squeeze here and you squeeze there. That's how we do it in business. And it seems to work.
That's where your business experience certainly comes in to help you. One last question, and that is, we've talked about COVID a bit and how it has impacted various communities, like the community of people with disabilities. What do you think the federal government ought to be doing as we go into what could be our next wave of COVID? There's, a feeling that we might anticipate increases as the weather gets colder. People have to be indoors. People are frankly just getting sick of living the way that we have to live. What would you recommend that the federal government ought to do about that?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think that the federal government has done an awful lot. I'm sure people will disagree. Nobody's perfect, but we've had pandemics in the past. We've had the bird flu and other types of flus, and we didn't quite have the overwhelming severity of it. This is like the black swan, where there's not as much cases, but if you get it, it's very, very bad. But I think the federal government has done an awful lot in terms of getting the machinery out there, the medical equipment out there, and finding sources for PPE. Could it have been done better, faster, quicker? I don't know. I wasn't in the situation to be able to address it, but I think we have to keep on being vigilant. I think the vaccine coming sooner rather than later will be, a godsend. And people need to be vigilant with everything else. Get your flu shots, wear your masks, wash your hands, be careful. And I think we need to support our first responders first and foremost. So whether that means the medical workers, the nurses and the doctors and the emergency rooms, but also our fire and our police. It's very distressing to see our police not backed up the way they should be, because anything can happen in a pandemic, and certainly our safety is paramount. So I would like to see first responders protected more.
Well, Mary Faye, thank you so much for joining us. And again, really appreciate the fact that you tuned in early since we had to bump you way up. Very gracious of you, and good luck with the campaign. And I hope that you and your family stay well and are avoiding COVID and manage to be healthy. Thanks
You
so
as well.
much.
Thanks for putting this together, and to all the other panelists, thanks for your participation.
Pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to Ryan Meehan next. Ryan Meehan is a Republican who did run a campaign in the 5th District earlier this year. He ran from early in the year until about May, and then decided to call off the campaign. He is a West Point graduate, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he's here today for us as a surrogate for President Trump. So Ryan Meehan, happy to have you come here. Thank you for spending some time with us. Jessica, I'm going to let you take over and open up his camera and his microphone so that we can see and hear Mr. Meehan. Okay, there you are. Mr. Meehan, if you would put your big shoes on, be the president now, and tell us about the president's policies and platforms for people with disabilities should he be reelected.
Sure. So one, just I'd like to say thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here. I'd like to say that I don't speak for the administration, but as a former Republican candidate, I'm happy to identify a few of the achievements the administration has had. As you noted, I'm a former Army officer. I served 2 combat tours to Afghanistan. And I'd say, you know, in terms of the issue of disabilities, my service has really brought that issue to the forefront of my reality. Specifically, I had one soldier on my first deployment. He was unfortunately shot in the neck, and he's been paralyzed from the waist down ever since. I had another soldier who suffered a fracture of skull on a parachuting accident in training. He's struggled with his own challenges since that incident, and both of them have made their way through the VA healthcare system and have lived with their disability since. So that makes this, you know, this issue's real, hits close to home for me. It's important. I'd like to go on. I'll identify 3 achievements of the administration that affect people with disabilities. First and foremost, in June of 2017, President Trump signed the VA Accountability Act and the Whistleblower Protection Act. That made it easier to discipline and hold members of the VA accountable. In the following June in 2018, President Trump signed the VA Admission Act into law that enacted some of the most significant changes to the VA healthcare system in the past 20 years. Some of those changes included giving veterans access to walk-in care, enabling the VA to modernize its assets and infrastructure, and created the Veterans Community Care Program, which gives veterans better access to the care they need and a wider choice in terms of healthcare providers. During the COVID pandemic, through the CARES Act, the administration has awarded an unprecedented $85 million in direct funding to more than 350 centers for independent living. Those funds have allowed individuals to receive food and prepared meals and alternative transportation for medical appointments. And here in Connecticut specifically, an incident arose where there was a complaint filed to the Office for Civil Rights that claimed that the hospital visitation policy was in violation of the Americans with Disability Act. And through that complaint, the Office of Civil Rights reviewed it, coordinated with the state of Connecticut, and ultimately that was resolved through the issue of an executive order in Connecticut that allows people with disabilities to have reasonable access to support, and including up to and including a support person for disabled people in hospital facilities.
Ryan, I suspect that this is not going to be your last political campaign, even though it's your first. I suspect that after having given so much service to your country that you have in mind another type of service. I understand that you transferred from UConn to West Point. I never realized that people did that. I guess I thought you went to West Point straight through, but interesting that you were able to do that.
Yeah, I was really fortunate. I was at the University of Connecticut when the terrorist attacks of September 11th happened. I'm sure, like most people on this call, that hit fairly close to home, and inspired in me a desire to serve and to give back. And I was fortunate enough to receive an appointment to the Academy from then Congresswoman Nancy Johnson. And I didn't exactly transfer. I actually had to start over. But it was well worth it, and one of the, I'm very proud graduate and glad to have served.
Well, that's quite an interesting story. I found that very fascinating, and I hope that we'll see more of you on the political scene. I want to just thank you so much for coming today and representing the Republican administration. It's been a pleasure having you with us. Thank you, Ryan.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jessica, I'm just going to ask whether we expect that we might get David X. Sullivan, or what we think the situation is going to be here. If you could just possibly let me know what you're thinking. In the meanwhile, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. This is the 5th Candidates Forum on Disability Issues, sponsored by the Connecticut Cross Disability Alliance, the Disability Rights Connecticut Group, Connecticut State Independent Living Council, Connecticut Developmental Disability Council, and the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. I'd like to remind you that there is, along with your email, that you did get a booklet on how to vote, not only information on the various candidates that we saw today, but also on registering to vote and where to vote and making a plan to vote. This came to you in your email. It explains all of the details about how to register to vote. Connecticut does try to make it very easy. You just have to be a United States citizen, 18 years old or by election day, a resident of a Connecticut town. Even if you have committed a felony, you can register to vote after you have completed your confinement and your parole. If you have not yet registered, you need to do that very quickly, because time is a wasting here. We are nearly 4 weeks away from, and just a tiny bit under 4 weeks away from the election. So all of that information is in there for you to be able to figure out how to register. Of course, this year, many, many more people are going to be voting by mail because of COVID and people not wanting to be exposed. However, there will be poll workers. I know quite a few people who have volunteered to work at the polls, since typically poll workers tend to be people in their 60s and older who are more susceptible to COVID, that a number of younger people have been recruited and will be showing up at the polls on that day. So there should be plenty of people to vote. We've been told, I've been told by the Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill, that there will be accommodations at every at every polling place, that there will be accommodations, including voting machines that are intended for people who have various kinds of disabilities, and that poll workers have been trained in how to assist you should you need any type of assistance with marking your ballot, seeing your ballot, if you have a visual disability. So there are many people who are going to be there to be able to help. And of course, there is no reason for an excuse for an absentee ballot this year. Normally in Connecticut, we have to name an excuse why we need an absentee ballot. This year, it has been proclaimed that anyone and everyone can use the excuse of COVID-19 as a reason for requesting an absentee ballot and not voting in person. So I just wanted to remind you of that. You're also going to be getting the booklet on the voting and on the candidates. That will be going out again with the YouTube link so that you can watch this again. And of course, we'll also inform you as to when the Connecticut Network will have this program ready for airing on their various platforms. And I believe now that we have been able to reestablish contact with David X. Sullivan. It's going to have to be by telephone, but that's okay. We got a good look at him earlier. So David Sullivan, are you there? Jessica, if you can open up his microphone, that'd be great.
We're waiting for him to unmute. Oh, there
Hello?
he is.
Hey, there he is. Excellent.
All right. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Let me just
There-
mention that one more time that David Sullivan is running against Johanna Hayes in the 5th District. He's been a federal prosecutor for 30 years in the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Connecticut. And he's joining us now by telephone because we had a little bit of a technical problem. So David, thank you for being with us today. And would you take about 3 minutes or so to tell us about your platform in regard to people who have disabilities?
Well, Diane, the ADA was passed approximately 30 years ago. I don't view it as a partisan issue. Working at the U.S. Attorney's Office and in the civil division, I know that we had people routinely filing lawsuits in support of those with disabilities, where accommodations were not being made so that they had equal access to stores and the opportunities to just have normal lives. It's a situation that, as someone who still teaches at the Yale Law School, the University of New Haven, at Western Connecticut State, I'm sensitive to the fact that as a teacher, I've had students who have had disabilities and special needs. And of course, it's always been a paramount concern that they are properly accommodated so that they can enjoy the same type of education and lives that we all do. You know, it's interesting. The Ideas Act is something that I think is a very good concept. I think that we have to raise the age from 21 to 30 years old. I think too many of our young adults are essentially aging out of services. And, you know, what I've heard today has been so encouraging by everyone. Everyone has such great ideas. And it really sadly comes down to money in so many instances. But I think that we need to forge a new partnership with the Department of Labor so that we can boost and encourage and create a vibrant workforce for those with disabilities. So as a younger man in high school, I did some volunteer work at Southbury Training School. I'm reluctant to say I was a cooking teacher at a nighttime adult class. It wasn't too complicated, and quite frankly, there was a lot of microwaving. That was because I was limited, not because they were. But you know, it's something that I think we all have to be very conscious of. And you know, as you mentioned, you don't want to speak after Congresswoman Rosa Delauro, and I was tasked with that. So maybe the storm that I think has prevented me from being there with video has given me this opportunity nonetheless. So essentially, that's about it. I think that we need to reinstate in-person special education. And, you know, it's something that, you know, I think we're all very sensitive to.
David, and by the way, I guess that we are colleagues. You mentioned that you teach at the University of New Haven, and that's where I am these days too, as a faculty member. So good to hear that. I can't claim to teach at Yale, but good for you. Let me ask you a question.
Well, you know, it's been a long time there, so I'm very fortunate.
Yeah. Since you're talking about a more robust employment picture, people with disabilities typically have an unemployment rate of 66%. And during the COVID pandemic, people with disabilities really disproportionately lost jobs for a variety of reasons. In some parts because the sector that they work in was extremely hard hit in service sectors. Other parts because of not being able to work from home because of various types of technological problems. What would you do in order to be able to help people maintain their place in the workforce as well as help others get into the workforce?
Well, that's an excellent question. As we look at COVID and trying to figure out how we're going to come out of this, I mean, what we're facing right now, you see with the Paycheck Protection Program and everything else, so many people have been, especially in the service industries, some of my own family members included, have lost jobs. And I don't think there's really an easy answer to that. But I think when we get through this, I think it's very important that we move forward. If we could go back to the economy of January 2020, I think we'd have a better opportunity. I do think, and I really don't want to get into the economic arguments, but I think that when we lowered the corporate tax rate and corporations had more money to reinvest in their businesses, which included hiring more people and providing people with more opportunity. I know that McDonald's Even people who were working 15 hours a week were given the opportunity for a $1,500 credit for education. Or those at Target and Lowe's were given $5,000 to adopt. And I think that it really is a partnership with business, but we need to have an economy that opens up again. And that's the balancing test, Diane, because quite frankly, right now, the safety of our citizens is always paramount and our first concern. But we have to make sure that there's an economy and there are jobs to come back to. So with respect to those with disabilities, I think that they have a disproportionate amount of unemployment prior to COVID, but I think, sadly, so many of us are all in the same boat at this point.
Well, since you mentioned that factor about the economy, what do you think that the federal government ought to be doing this winter as we are anticipating a possible rise in COVID cases again as the weather gets cold and people are forced indoors more, and perhaps people are just getting tired of having to live the way they live since COVID? What would you like to see the federal government doing?
Well, as I said, I think for those with disabilities, it'd be nice to have in-person special education again and to reinstate that. But we'd have to do it exercising a lot of practical precautions, again, with masks, social distancing. Distance learning right now is very difficult for all. And I'm as we speak, I'm giving an exam in criminal law, but it's difficult to engage with students, and I'm concerned that those with disabilities, those who suffer from depression, drug addiction, alcohol abuse, and the isolation of the elderly. These are the same things that are plaguing those with disabilities who are unable to get out. And I wish there were or was an easy answer as to what do we do next. But I hope that we are moving forward with a vaccine. I hope that we can continue to recognize those who are most vulnerable to the virus, and hopefully the science will catch up to our population.
David, I know that this isn't your particular area necessarily of the law, but some of the legislation that's being proposed and that has actually been voted on a couple of times by the House, legislation that provides some help to people who have been unemployed due to COVID, has some parts in it also that would shield nursing homes from liability, and in certain circumstances might waive civil rights protections, including the ADA. What's your position on this, and what would you do about that in terms of your constituents, both those who are survivors of nursing facility errors and those who are operating nursing facilities?
Well, I'd like to see the legislation, but I'd be very reluctant with regard to both, whether it's civil rights or the ADA. I think that sometimes that can be a convenient excuse not to do the things we need to do. But my knee-jerk reaction would be to oppose it. I need to know what, why, when, and where, and the balancing test. I mean, sadly, right now, the civil rights of all our citizens have been restricted a bit as to what we can do and when we can do it, and opening up or reopening up businesses, or where we can go and what we can attend. And so I think, as others have said, it's really a new world, and so much of this is first impression. And had we had better numbers coming from the WHO and from China, perhaps our models would have been different. I think there's enough blame to go around, and I hope everyone is able to share in the credit as we get through this.
Well, David Sullivan, I'm so glad that you were able to join us. I'm glad that we overcame our technical troubles, and I'm interested in the fact that you're also giving an exam right now. Good multitasking on your part.
Well, Diane, thank you. And again, I apologize to all, and for all those that had to, rearrange their own schedules. I think it was a weather issue, and it's starting to subside here in Southbury. But again, I apologize.
Well, we know that that was not your fault, so thank you so much, and thanks for being willing to roll with the punches and come back and join us later. David X. Sullivan, good to have you, and good luck with the campaign, and good luck in
Thank you very much.
For the next several months as we continue the pandemic. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane.
Okay.
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody who joined us today. We had such a remarkable turnout, all of the congressional candidates, surrogates for both presidential candidates, as well as about 300 people in the audience, which was just wonderful and a real tribute to the people that organized this, including Melissa Marshall and Darius Smith and a number of other people who were able to put on a really good event in spite of the fact that we can't be together and be in a hotel ballroom as we usually are at this time of the year for our Disabilities Forum. I'd also like to really thank the people that sponsored this, the Connecticut Cross Disability Alliance, the Disability Rights Connecticut Group, Connecticut State Independent Living Council, Connecticut Developmental Disability Council, and the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. I'd like to urge you to make sure that you fill out the survey evaluating this event. I hope that you liked it and that you will help us obtain the funding to do this again. And I also want to urge everyone to make sure that you are registered and are able to vote. And with that, I believe that we can conclude our Disability Issues Forum for the year 2020, a year like no other, and let's hope we don't have another one like it anytime soon. I'm Diane Smith, and I thank you so much for joining us today.